Effective board leadership in transformation programs. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries, and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learning from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. Your positive feedback on the podcast Steering the Shift, Board Leadership in Times of Transformation, encouraged us to record another episode about transformation. I think the topic is so relevant at the moment because there are so many shifts in the outside world. Geopolitical changes, AI, what does it mean? And it's very clear that business as usual is not an option. And all the current step-by-step change processes that some of us might have done in the 90s are completely outdated. The time simply isn't there. So everyone talks about the transformation, but the how to do it and how to do it well and how to jump on it and actually initiate it when you can't be certain of the outcome is quite a different matter. So I invited Lan O'Connor again and continue our discussion on transformation. So this time we really look, why is it actually so difficult? What makes this for boards particularly so difficult to initiate and to monitor transformation programs? Why do so many boards get it wrong? And above all, what do the boards do who get it right? So I hope you enjoy listening. Lan, welcome back to the Better Boards podcast series. It's fantastic to have you again.
Well, thank you, Sabine. It's great to be back so soon.
Yeah, so soon.
I feel like I must have missed something that you're inviting me back.
No, there is a very good reason for this. I think, it's the feedback we get. Thank you to all our active listeners who provide very proactive feedback. I think a lot of boards are currently struggling with the topic of transformation. Mm-hmm. I mean, we see this in the board evaluations we do when we ask people. So they assign a very high importance to transformation. And yet when you ask them how well developed is know-how around transformation in the boardroom, that receives a less enthusiastic rating. So there is always a big gap between the desired know-how they would like to have on transformation and the actual know-how they have.
It's like we all want to be fitter, slimmer, and more charming, but it's hard work.
Yeah.
It's hard work. And I think possibly, when you say it's definitely desirable, or the moment has come, we talked about before, when you recognize a transformation is necessary. I mean, these days, everybody talks about AI requiring transformation. So you recognize it's necessary, but the amount of work to achieve the target or to adapt to a new target is significant. And in fact, if you go back to what the fundamental reason for a board, boards are fundamentally structured to manage risk and preserve shareholder value, which is the antithesis of a transformation. A large-scale transformation is inherently risky, as we talked about before. And when you start, it may have uncertain outcomes, even though there's a certain target, and significant upfront investment, all of which are very easy to evaluate for an external analyst, but requires a certain amount of faith in the transformation requirement. So there's a natural tension between the fiduciary duty of a board to be prudent and the strategic need to, let's say, to embrace something that could be quite disruptive. So there's a kind of in the first place, this mismatch. When you think about how the board deals with the outside world, deals with those stakeholders, there's a time horizon. There are set pieces, quarterly or annual set pieces driven by market expectations, those analysts who look at their spreadsheets and their cells in the spreadsheets. But as we mentioned before, true transformation it's a cadence of its own. It's got a timeline of its own, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that does not necessarily match very well with a quarterly discussion with analysts. And therefore, there's a requirement, I think, for board members to be able to defend the journey, the transformation journey, and to deal with what are the natural ups and downs of a transformation journey. So those are two very obvious, I guess, reasons that a board would be uncomfortable with it, recognizing the need, but finding it somehow running against their natural role and their natural engagement with the market that can test them.
It requires a leap of faith, doesn't it?
It does. And in fact, that's a very good point, because in that leap of faith, the expertise needed to deliver it, it may lie outside the collective experience of the board. I mean, we talked earlier about the board getting together to share that collective experience. You can still find gaps. If you go back to what we said about AI, directors who built their careers in pre-digital or a very stable market environment, may lack some specific knowledge, cybersecurity, for example, or sustainability alongside AI. So there's maybe a lack of expertise. And so that can mean that you might feel like you are lacking something that allows you normally to challenge or guide the executive team. And then a natural consequence of that is that there may be over-reliance on management. So on one hand, it's delegated to the executive. On the other hand, the executive then sends back curated information. The CEO and the executive team may summarize into essential information. And so then it's difficult to get an unfiltered view, for the board to have an unfiltered view, and then to go back to the set pieces to have a very strong narrative, because at the end of the day, the board generally has to defend the narrative of the transformation in those investor meetings. And without having detail, it's sometimes difficult to defend that. So there's a few reasons why boards, on the one hand, recognize that a transformation is necessary, and on the other hand, find themselves often in a position where it's an uncomfortable defense or an uncomfortable role to be put at the front of that transformation.
So let's look a little bit on the brighter side of things. Yeah. You have been part of very large, and it has to be said, successful transformations, because not every transformation is, of course, successful. But you have been privileged to be part of it and to be playing a key role in these transformations. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? What are the ingredients, or what do the people do who get it right? And what do the board members do to get it right?
So I would say, number one, is a board where board members are, let's say, future-focused or curious, spending time thinking about what could happen in the next 5 to 10 years, what is over the horizon, not looking backwards, reviewing last quarter's results or trajectory, because in many ways, a lot of the KPIs that organizations rely on are backward-looking rather than forward-looking. So for a board member or a board to be successful, generally speaking, they're learning, open, inviting external experts into the board to advise on particular transformation targets, and looking to understand what's happening. One thing that I have noticed a bit more recently is opening the network to the organization that you're overseeing. So a board has one of its most powerful assets, a network of other board members, other executives, other partners, other advisors, and to open that network to the team that's trying to deliver a transformation can be very helpful. I talk about engagement. There's an expression that I've used a lot, constructively dissident. So disagreement does not equal disengagement. It equals engagement, meaning that challenge the trajectory, challenge the plan. And I think by that kind of constructive challenge, you get a better result. That's a real feature, which is the opposite of groupthink, if you like. So debate is a tool for strengthening the strategy, not a sign of conflict.
And yet it makes a lot of board members uncomfortable. I mean, I heard so much about that you need to ask challenging questions and really bring in different perspectives. And yet, actually, when you are in the boardroom, this is a very difficult thing to do.
You know, if you do it explicitly, and this, I guess, is a world that you live in, Sabine, which is create that psychological safety, if that's an expression that makes sense, but an environment whereby it's not a personal attack. It's not even an attack. It's an engagement and a challenge. And by challenge, you improve. And I think initially, it's got to be explicitly set up. It might feel a little bit artificial, but eventually it becomes a habit. And you asked me, what are the characteristics of effective boards overseeing transformation? It's those that are as I said, open, curious, but also open to learn. And I think that's where this challenging assumptions, let's say, rather than challenging each other, challenge assumptions, get behind the rationale. So understanding the what and the so what and the what next, but remaining at a strategy level, okay, not getting operationally involved. So not micromanaging, not undermining, but rather challenging. If you say that this is something that's difficult or people shy away from, then I believe it's valuable. And advisors like yourself, Sabine, can help boards, if they want to do it, set that up and learn what makes sense for them, because it's a culture that will suit that board.
No, absolutely.
And maybe, as you mentioned earlier, you recruit directors who bring specific expertise. It's far easier to learn from an expert. And that might be a good trigger to start that kind of debate.
So now you started the debate, you managed to get a transformation off the ground, you kicked it off, yeah? But now of course, you need to monitor the progress. And another thing what we are seeing is that not all boards really have the right and the appropriate measures for such programs.
Yes. And in fact, if I think about some of the successful transformations that I've kind of seen and been involved in, you end up maybe with one or two new metrics that start to determine the direction of the transformation. You and I spoke, I think, off air about one in particular, where to set the targets and the metrics for a transformation, one organization I was involved in, we invited a friendly analyst in to say, well, look, if you looked at this company and you looked over the horizon and you take a look at our ambition, which is to go global, what would you expect us to be doing? What performance metrics would you apply to us in this new kind of, let's say, League One rather than Premier League rather than League One? And they gave us 7 metrics, and we took those and translated them into operational metrics for the organization, including some new, what you might call more operational, less financial metrics. And those became metrics that meant something all the way through the business, but also were articulated back to share price, which is important for the board and part of the vernacular of the board. So we found a set of metrics that could be part of the new transformation vernacular for the organization, but were linked back to impact on, in this case, share price, operating margin, and volatility of the share price, to be precise, which was an exercise in itself. It was an exercise worth doing, and that permitted the board to remain engaged on the board relevant metrics and the executive on the executive relevant metrics.
Can you recall some of these board relevant metrics?
Well, I mentioned some of them. Start off by saying beta, so the volatility of the share price, was not attractive. It attracted investors that tended to bet on the share price rather than invest for the long term. In order to reduce that, the company needed longer term, more valuable B2B contracts. And therefore, the portfolio of work done by the organization had to refocus on more B2B, less B2C, longer, higher value outsourcing contracts.
Interesting.
So annuity business rather than discrete business. And that's an example of how the operational metrics of a business can articulate back to a strategic target that is relevant to investor relations.
No, great. That's really helpful to make it really practical, because that's what our listeners love, these practical.
It's hard to be practical, Sabine, without giving away too much information about companies.
Any other tips and tricks you can share with our listeners about what successful boards do in a successful transformation?
I think I mentioned when we talk about metrics, that's one side of it, but there's also the process of the transformation. Metrics are part of the rational, what we talked about before, and I don't apologize for repeating this, the rational, the emotional, and the political sides of a transformation. The rational is measurable, provable, trackable rationale for transformation. And it can be a lead or a lag indicator. By a lead indicator, I mean, you might make an investment now that you expect to make a return on later, and that can be tracked. Endless investments in AI, for example, without a return or a scale up on the pilots that have gone so well, without a scale up, are metrics that are very important. Then there's the political, which is not a metric, but it's ensuring that the transformation that the board is overseeing is able to make the decisions it needs to make, that there is correct oversight, that there is correct reporting, that there is correct decision-making, and that decision-making makes its way all the way from the board to the field, so to speak. So that's political with a small p. Is the organization set up to make the decisions needed to effect the transformation at the right pace? And then emotional, which is important as much for the board, that is engage. We talked about challenge and constructive dissidence, if you like, but engagement I think is really important. So for the E, I use it, I say emotional, find a reason to stick with it and to push and to innovate. You could equally call it E for engagement. And I think those are characteristics that are relevant for any transformation, whether you sit at the board, you sit at the executive, or you sit somewhere within the organization. Rational, there's a good business case for it. Political, I can make a decision and I can report back. And emotional, it means something to me. And if you go back to what we said at the start about a board being able to defend the narrative for the transformation, that's in the category of E for emotional. It has to be a narrative, a story, and a transformation that the board believes in. Otherwise, it won't be able to defend it during those difficult times in investor meetings. So you say, what is a characteristic apart from a good business case and good KPIs? Political and emotional sense in the transformation is absolutely important.
No, fantastic. That I think these boil it down to these three elements is really, really helpful. I know that a lot of our listeners are company secretaries.
Right.
Any tips for them, how they can support their boards as part of a big transformation project?
What I learned from company secretaries is that the board papers are often have in them elements that relate one to the other. And I think for board secretaries, this narrative, this is the implications of a decision of strategy to a decision of finance, to a decision of operations, to a decision of restructuring, how those link together to support the transformation. I think a company secretary in preparing those board papers could present the key points within the narrative of the transformation. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but as far as possible, I think it's very helpful for a board that the secretary will highlight those key points, those key cross-functional points. I believe you're going to be talking at some point about the use of AI in helping board secretaries make those connections and make those narratives that cut across the different board packs. And I won't step into that zone, but I think there are tools that board secretaries can use to really help get that narrative across.
Fantastic. I'm looking at the watch in front of me. Sadly, we have to come to an end, Lan. And as always, what are the three takeaways or what are the three things our listeners should take away from this conversation?
I've come forearmed. I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I made some notes. There you go. So let's see. I'm not going to repeat rational, political, emotional, but I did. I'm going to say probably that shift. A board's traditional role is oversight. During a transformation, as well as oversight, you need some foresight, which is clearing the way, spending less time on what happened last quarter and more time understanding the forces that are going to shape the industry and drive the transformation. So not only in the narrative and the story that you tell to investors in those critical set pieces, but also actively seeking external perspectives, challenging each other, challenging assumptions. So there's a point number one, shift from oversight to foresight. And the second is the board composition. We talked about getting different skills and expertise on the board as needed for that particular transformation. If a transformation is being driven by AI, clearly there's an AI expertise that could be very useful, even a transformation expertise, a sustainability expertise. Equally, there may be a need for that composition to be as much about culture as it is about content. So we talked about finding the psychological safety in the board to have those conversations that may be difficult or not normal. And maybe that means setting a meeting apart to do that. So I think the board composition is a strategic asset, maybe for the period of the transformation, maybe permanently, maybe for the future setup. And we talked about measures. I think we can't get away from that. The lead and the lag indicators. I think everybody is familiar with the balanced scorecard, and particularly that element of the balanced scorecard, which is lagging indicators, looking in the mirror, leading indicators, determining what do you want to change now, and get a friendly analyst in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lan. Thank you for contributing to the Better Bots podcast series.
Thank you for inviting me back, Sabine, and always interested to hear your questions. They're always very difficult questions.
Thank you for listening. And as always, if you have any comments on this podcast, if you would like to suggest a topic, if you would like to learn what we do at Better Boards, and above all, how we do it, reach out. We are always interested in meeting new people. We are always happy to chat. And there are real people behind this podcast, behind Better Boards. So reach out. Looking forward to hearing from you. And once again, thank you for listening.